Have you ever wondered why do people abuse power? Why some people oppress others? Who is evil? Why is it that the wicked always have multitudes of followers that outnumber the good? If you would like to know the answers to these questions, you are in the right place. Welcome back to Headspace Diaries, and today we will be discussing the Milgram's Obedience Study. What this study looks at is mindless conformity and engaged followership. So now we already discussed a bit about conformity in the previous episode about the Stanford prison experiment. So if you missed that one, you can always go back and listen to it. Okay, so let's come back to the episode. Stanley Milgram conducted this experiment in 1963 at Yale University. He was an American social psychologist born on August 15, 1933, and he was deeply influenced by the events of the Holocaust, probably because he himself was Jewish. Born to parents Adele, who was born in Israel by the way, and Samuel Milgram, who had immigrated to the United States from Romania and Hungary respectively during World War I, Stanley had immediate and extended family who survived the Holocaust. After the war, relatives of his who had survived the Nazi concentration camp and both concentration camp tattoos stayed with the Milgram family in New York for a time. I think Milgram was from the Brooklyn or Bronx area, but I couldn't be sure. Now, around the same time, by the way, Milgram is also known for his other experiments, that is the small world experiment and familiar stranger experiment as well. So if we have time in this episode, we will cover it, and if we don't, we will be featuring it separately in another episode. So, like I said, around the same time this experiment was happening, Adolf Eichmann was being tried in Jerusalem. Eichmann was recognized to be the chief architect of the Holocaust, and Stanley Milgram focused on one particular account of Eichmann's trial by Hannah Arendt, in which she observed that whereas previously psychiatrists had imagined that because Eichmann was behind such a massive scaled atrocity, he must be a sadistic and perverted person. But upon observation, they found that he was just a thoroughly uninspiring civil servant. She argued that Eichmann had done what he had simply because he was asked to do so, and he followed instructions unquestioningly. And this was a frightening thought. Milgram saw the connections of what she said with his own participants in this experiment. So now that we've laid out the context, let's hear what the experiment was in detail. So, when he first began this experiment, he had intended to compare the obedience levels of those in the United States and those in Germany because he suspected that the Germans might be highly submissive. And once he began the baseline study, he found that the results in the US itself was so high that he abandoned the cross-cultural comparison because his findings suggested a universal human vulnerability to authority pressures. Now, for this study, he recruited participants from New Haven and the surrounding communities through newspaper advertisements and told them that he was conducting an experiment on memory and learning. That, my friends, is deception, right there at the beginning of the experiment. Now, the study had 40 participants who were all males between 20 and 50 years old, and they were paid $4.50 for their participation in the experiment. The procedure involved pairing participants with a confederate, and here a confederate is someone who already knows what is going to happen in the actual experiment, and here we'll call him Mr. Wallace, and they were assigning roles through a rigged draw. The participant was always the teacher, and he was instructed to administer electric shocks to the confederate, who was always the learner, for incorrect answers to a memory task. So the teacher had to teach 10 words to the learner, of which 7 he would get wrong intentionally. The electric shocks were of 15 volts increment, which means the teacher would be administering 105 volts of shock to the learner. So in actuality, the learner who was strapped to the shock machine was an actor and didn't actually receive the shocks, but the teacher didn't know this. After the practice round, a second list was given and the teacher was told to repeat the procedure until all word pairs were learned correctly. The participants then read one word from each pair and provided 4 possible options for the matching word. The learner had to indicate which word had originally been paired with the first word by pressing one of the 4 switches. So before the experiment, the participant was given a mild electric shock of 45 volts to the wrist to convince them that the shocks were genuine. Milgram watched all of this drama through a one-way mirror. Now, another deception was that the learner's reactions to the shocks were predetermined. At 75 volts, the learner emitted the first audible grunts of pain. By 120 volts, the learner's vocal protests became louder and more intense and insistent. At 150 volts, the learner began to complain specifically about a heart condition. And around 300 volts, the learner pounded on the wall, indicating significant distress but ceasing verbal responses. And after 330 volts, the learner became silent, creating the impression that they were either unconscious or unresponsive. The purpose of this stage distress was to measure the participants' willingness to obey authority, even when they perceived that they were causing harm. The experimenter who administered the fake shocks was called Mr. William, who is also an actor, and he was stern and dressed in a grey technician coat. So when the teacher refused to administer a shock, the experimenter, Mr. Williams, instructed a series of standardized orders or prods to ensure that they continued. So the prods were as follows. The first one was, please continue or please go on. And then he said, the experiment requires you to continue. And later on, he would say that it is absolutely essential that you continue. And the fourth prod was, you have no other choice but to continue. So an interesting observation pointed out by Professor Alex Haslam was that only one of these prompts limited the freedom of choice, and that is the last one. And the data suggests that this prompt had 0% compliance. So the most effective were the first and second prompts. This is why Professor Alex Haslam believes that this study reveals something more complex than simple obedience. Haslam explains that the participants did not act merely because they were ordered to. Instead, they believed they were serving a greater cause. Their actions were shaped by identification with the scientific mission and the authority figure who represented it. That is, people commit harmful acts when they see themselves as part of a meaningful mission. This is what is meant by engaged followership, and it is a different perspective of the Milgram Obedience Study. This experiment was not just one, but a series of 18 variations of the experiment conducted to establish the appropriate data. And he found that 65% of the participants continued to the highest level for 450 volts, and 100% continued to at least 300 volts. The variations manipulated elements such as proximity of the learner, the proximity and legitimacy of the authority figure, the presence of dissenting peers, and the setting of the experiment. Obedience was highest when the authority figure was physically present, the learner was out of sight, and the experiment took place in a prestigious university setting. Every participant at some point questioned the procedure, and many openly pleaded to stop or offer to return their payment rather than continue hurting the learner. So they did not find it easy, and they were completely uncomfortable by these actions. But it's interesting that they proceeded to obey despite all of this. So it is said that before the experiment, they were given a speech conveying how important this experiment was to the scientific community. And even after debriefing, the majority of the participants reported that they were happy instead of distressed at the deception. Why? Because they were happy they got the chance to participate and contribute to people's scientific understanding. Other factors that may have affected obedience were personality traits, formality of the location, like I said, a prestigious university setting, and behavior of the experimenter, etc. So, the physical separation from the learner reduced the emotional impact of the participants' actions. and the presence of the experimenter allowed participants to feel that they were not solely responsible for their actions. So, in psychology, we call this diffused responsibility, diffused accountability. And here, the rapid progression of events gave participants little opportunity to consider that their actions were causing harm. So Milgram explained the behavior of his participants with his agency theory. He said that people have two types of behavior in a social situation. One is the autonomous state, where people direct their own actions, and the second is the agentic state, where people allow others to direct their actions and then pass off the responsibility for the consequences to the person who was giving the orders. The engaged followership theory or the social identification theory says that people will obey when they strongly identify with the authority's purpose or values. This reinterpretation implies that obedience in Milgram studies is partly about identification with the experimenter's mission. Participants may have felt that they were collaborating with the authority rather than simply caving into orders. Now, there were unethical aspects as such in this study, such as lack of informed consent and deception. Why? Because the participants were deceived regarding the purpose of the study, and thus they could not make an informed choice. So they could not give an informed consent. The experiment also violated the right of participants to be protected from distress. It is said that signs of tension, including trembling, sweating, stuttering, laughing nervously, biting lips, and digging fingernails into the palms or hands, were seen. 3 participants apparently had uncontrollable seizures, and many pleaded to be allowed to stop the experiment. Milgram defended against these allegations by claiming that the participants' distress was only short term and stress levels decreased after debriefing. So, as we conclude this episode, we have a lot to think about. Was this engaged followership theory really something that happened in our history? Was this the reason for the rise of the Nazis and the Holocaust? And was this really a study about obedience? And how much of engaged followership is a defense mechanism of the followers to reduce distress by adopting the authority's vision? So this question in particular has intrigued me ever since I began my research into the study. I mean, how much of this engaged followership is actually identifying with the authority's purpose, authority's vision and values, and how much of it is a defense mechanism because they fear that they have no choice and they unconsciously decide that they can rationalize with it and they can identify with it instead of thinking that they have no choice. So, finally, was this an unethical experiment? And what do the statistics say about compliance, let's say? If we were about almost willing to electrocute a man for the sake of science. Now that is a frightening thought, I would like to end this episode. Thank you for listening to Headspace Diaries, and let me know down in the comment section what you think about this episode and any other topic you would like us to cover in the following episodes. If you found this interesting, do share with your loved ones, and as always, have a nice day.